Begun my sermon with something my grandmother said, and that was about being part of the Clean Plate Club. And I've mentioned it so many times because for whatever reason, it is ingrained in my head that if you don't finish everything on your plate, there will be children in Africa who are starving. And I don't know what the correlation is between that. Wow, that elicited a response far bigger than I had anticipated. I hope you at home are now talking to each other on the couch and saying, oh, I should have finished that croissant this morning. But they drilled it into us that you had to finish everything on your plate. Now, that didn't mean that all the food was gone. It just meant that you had to eat what you took. I am faced with a different problem entirely, and that is, for example, when Sharon and I finish dinner and we're cleaning up, there is still food that's left over. Either it's because I'm used to cooking for 7, Sharon for 4, and now there's just 2 of us in the house, or because there just happens to be some leftovers. The problem that we have is not with leftovers, it's when we decide what actually makes it to the level of leftover. Do you put back 3 string beans? How many asparagus count for leftovers? 4. And how do you count roasted potatoes? See, these are all problems that we have in the modern world, and that is how much food gets thrown out and how much food is considered leftovers and can be turned into something else in a few days. Or, as is in the case with our house, how long does it stay in a container in the refrigerator before it becomes a science experiment? I know for sure that when it becomes fuzzy, you can't eat it anymore. And I don't know how many times I have been asked the question, do you think we could still eat this? Or does this smell funny to you? I wish there was no more sermon here because that was the best of it. But what's interesting in this is in this week's Parsha, we have exactly this phrase. The idea of what is considered a leftover. There is a very interesting moment at the beginning of the Parsha in which it says, "V'hanoteret mimeno yochlu Aharon uvanav matzot te'achel u'v'makom kadosh b'chatzer oel moed yochluhu." That what's left over is eaten by Aaron and his sons. They make matzah essentially out of it, and they then eat it in a holy place. What happens here, just to tell you the background, is that the karban mincha is taken alongside a frankincense offering. Flour is taken alongside a frankincense. And the way it was measured is you would take a handful of flour, not an exact measurement, you should know. It's the way my grandmother used to cook, not the way I cook, right? You put a little in and a little, right? So that's the way it was. You would take a handful, and then from that handful, you would take flour and sprinkle it on. And then what was left over in your hand was then turned into matzot. And that happens today with our cooking as well, right? You take the leftovers and you can turn it into something else. And in this case, the leftover, the mincha offering, what's left over then becomes matzah. And it is a nod towards the fact that matzah is really something less than what would be a full loaf. And then we go on, and essentially what we do is we read more in the Torah, and it says the following: V'im neder o nidava zevach karbano b'yom hikrivu et zivcho ye'achel u'mimacharat v'hanotar mimenu ya'ochel, that you then sometimes offer what's known as a free will offering. A nidava is a volunteer, right? A volunteer offering. You just decide you want to give it. And then you burn it on the altar, but not entirely. It's not a full burnt offering, but it's a partially burnt offering. And then it says you should eat that sacrifice. The priest should eat that sacrifice on that day. But if it's such a large offering that they can't eat it on that day, they can have it tomorrow. They can have it the next day. They don't have to eat it all in one sitting. It's the origin of the fact that it's okay to eat pizza for breakfast. But that's interesting because it says that sometimes you don't have to eat it all. It's a problem that my brother and I both have, and that is there's just a little bit left on your plate. Do you stop eating when you're not hungry, or do you just finish it because you don't want to put it back, or you can't put it back, or you don't want to leave it there? So many of us will force ourselves to eat that. And you know it comes from the very famous phrase in modern American circumstance, and that is, there's always room for dessert. Right? You can always figure out how to make more room. And then the text of the Torah, of course, continues. V'hanotar babasar uvalechem ba'esh tisrafu. And in some circumstances, says the text of the Torah, you burn what's left over. That you take it and you burn it up entirely. You say to yourself, you know what? We're not going to eat it. We're going to get rid of it. And so that third option says it's not even enough for a snack later. And what we have is an opportunity to say, you know, at some point you just throw it out. The word that stands out most for me, of course, in this morning's parsha is not karban, sacrifice. It's the word noteret, leftover. What's left over in our life. It's not the word sarfu, which means to burn, which I cannot help but hear the horrible catastrophes that result in burnings in our society. That's not the word. It's hanoteret, what's left over. I tried my best to come up with a sermon that didn't reference what's going on in Israel or the circumstances with our hostages. I'm tired after 175 days of a war, of talking about it. But every time I hear about what's left over, that's all I can think about. What's left over when the sacrifice has already been made? What's left over? Or who's left behind? Or what are they going to make of their lives after the catastrophe is over? I can't help, and it's become more of a problem in the last few weeks, but to think about those still held hostage. I thought maybe I would do an exercise with our kids. I have a list of all the people who are still held hostage. Thought with our high school kids, maybe what I would do is I'd go through the original list. We have a stack of them, of pictures of people who were taken hostage initially, and go through with them and sort out the ones that are still there, because I have a list of those people who are still held captive. But it's too much for them. It's not something that is appropriate for high school kids. But for those of us who are adults, it's on our minds all the time. We must truly recognize the moment that we find ourselves in. The prophet Jeremiah called out, Kicho amar Adonai, Ranu li Yaakov simcha v'tzalu berosh hagoyim hishmiu halalu v'imru hoshana Adonai alamcha et she'erit Yisrael. We hear this phrase, she'erit Yisrael, over and over again throughout our liturgy. You know, on a weekday morning when we say Tachnun, we say Shomer Sherit Yisrael. God, please recall the remnants of Israel. I can't help but feel as though we find ourselves in that moment in which we're collecting the remnants of Israel, like the early pioneers of the state of Israel did in immediately the aftermath of the Holocaust, where they sought out the remnants of Israel, the children who had been hidden and then brought to Israel. The prophet Jeremiah says, cry out in joy for Jacob, shout at the crossroads of the nations, sing aloud in praise and say, save, O Eternal One, your people, the remnant of Israel. We will, as they say in Israel, dance again with the remnants, those people left over after this conflict is concluded. For us right now, there are, like in this morning's Parsha, 3 separate sets of remnants, 3 separate groups of Jews who are left over, like the parts of the sacrifices that were given. One are those who are still held in hostage. There are those, on the other hand, who are a second group, and those are the people who have been returned from captivity. We can only imagine what they're going through. And then there is another group, and those are those young Jews and Arabs side by side, and Druze side by side, who are fighting on the front lines. And it's that group that will determine the fate of the first 2 groups. And I say, unlike the 3rd category of leftovers in this week's Parsha, no category of Jew is disposable. Every Jew is worth saving. Every person who is a victim of October 7th and the subsequent 175 days and beyond is worth saving. Some, however, we know will never return to their lives. Some will be able to reconstruct. Some will be able to rebuild a semblance of a life. But all will have October 7th emblazoned on our souls. There's a beautiful Yiddish folktale which was made popular in America by Phoebe Gilman called Something from Nothing. I don't know if you've heard that little child's book. It's about a boy named Joseph whose grandfather transforms his blanket many times over the years, but what can be done when the final item is lost? Gilman's version of the Yiddish folktale won the 1993 Ruth Schwartz Award. And so the story is, when Joseph was a baby, his grandfather made him a wonderful blanket. But as Joseph grows older, the blanket becomes tattered and worn. "Throw it out," cries Joseph's mother. Luckily, Grandpa is an extraordinary tailor. He can fix anything. So with a snip here and a snip there, a few stitches there, Grandpa transforms the treasured blanket into a vest, and then into a jacket, and then into a vest, and then into a Shabbat tie, and then into a handkerchief, and finally into a beautiful button. But when the button is lost, even Grandpa can't help. After all, how can you make something from nothing? In a rich and loving portrait of shtetl life, Phoebe Gilman presents a traditional Jewish folktale about a family, about love, about ingenuity that warms the heart of the young and old. There are those who will never return, having made the ultimate sacrifice, al kiddush Hashem, for the sake of our people and our nation and our God. See, some things, some people will never return. But those who are make up the She'erit Yisrael, the remnants of Israel. And from them we can make something beautiful. We are like those in Israel, the remnants of Israel. And we must make something of this moment. We must make something of ourselves because we too are left over. We've been given a chance to make something more, to do something more. I pray that this is a moment of awakening for all of us. A moment that eventually will turn from darkness to light again, as the prophet Jeremiah teaches. And I pray that until that moment, we hug each other until our pieces come back together. Because we need each other, and we need every person to emerge from this darkness into the light. We pray for the safe return of our hostages as quickly as possible. B'mheira b'yameinu. Shabbat shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184. Please rise.